Good afternoon. I'm Bob Rowe with Northwestern Energy. First, Lawrence, congratulations on an extraordinary day. I think probably most of us in the room are friends and fans of Lawrence's. My admiration for you goes back to well beyond when you joined EEI, but in terms of M&A activity, I think one of the great acquisitions, Tom, was when you got Lawrence's great leadership here. So congratulations. You worked very hard both for today and tomorrow's session. It's tremendous. I want to, yes. I want to do one thing on a little personal level, if I could. My nephew, Thomas Mosier, who currently is at the World Bank, is starting a job with National Labs in just about a month, is here. Double PhD in engineering. His PhD research was on developing, if I've got this right, climate model to site run-of-the-river hydro projects. So I'm from Montana. Well, I'll be seeing a lot of him. He'll be doing field research in Montana. Instead, he went to interesting places like Pakistan, now Afghanistan. So I know he's enjoyed being here, and if you get a chance, do visit with him. It's very much a part of what we're doing. I think what we will do is tie together a lot of the themes that have been touched on today. Each of the presenters who have tremendous and diverse experience will start things off. I have a few questions, but I hope we'll move relatively quickly to a good, lively group discussion. As you know from the agenda, the topic here is driving growth and performance, an integrated energy system approach. Now, there are external and internal components to that, and both are important. There were a couple of questions earlier about how well do we play with other actors, for example, in the smart city, or as I prefer, smart community space. Do we interact with other parties with development needs, growth needs, sustainability objectives? Related to that, actually, is how much flexibility do the regulators give us to go in those directions? Sometimes I wonder, we're all concerned about disintermediation from the Facebooks, Apples, Googles, and whatnot, but I wonder about disintermediation by regulators tending to be perhaps more backward-looking than might be the case in the Rio model, for example. Just as importantly, though, is the internal model. Most of us, to some extent, are organized in silos. We grow up with particular jobs. Look at our company's responsibility from our role. If you work in the transmission side, every problem has a transmission solution, same on supply, same on distribution. Things like storage really muddle the waters on that. So again, the big external question, how to capture the value of the services that we provide in complementary fashions. Internally, how are we organized to think about our roles a little bit differently? And then virtually everyone who's talked today has referenced to some extent the regulatory constraints and challenges. So with that, we have four wonderful presenters and a slight change in the batting lineup, but we have Nigel Barber, CEO of Powerco in New Zealand. I love, by the way, the 8-gauge wire. I did, in fact, look that up, and you go right to it on Wikipedia. Astrid Brunt from Norway, Gary Sutherland from Hydro-Quebec, and Anthony Hadley from AMP Capital Investments, based here in the U.S., but an Australian company. Is it correct? So with that, let's just go right down the row. Astrid, if you could start and give us your perspective, again, both the internal and the external challenges.
Is this one on? So I come from Statnett, the company in Norway, and Statnett is a transmission system operator. And the Norwegian system is very different in that we have 96% hydropower. And that gives us two opportunities. One is that in the new renewable world, for system operation, our system operation people are used to a weather-dependent system, which is a good skill. The other one is that hydropower, the way we have it, it's a multi-year, it's high mountains in Norway. That means that we can have multi-year storage, which makes the hydro very compatible with both thermal, but even more so with wind and solar, which are being developed in the UK, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and the rest of Europe. So one business opportunity is to connect the Norwegian hydro with the other production in the rest of Europe. It does create a lot of welfare, and it does make opportunities for a cleaner system and to meet the Paris targets. So what's the challenge, if any? I think the biggest challenge is that we have a very regulated industry. And what's the biggest challenge with the regulation? I think from a legal perspective, my background is law, it is the biggest regulated challenge for a long-term investment, like in HVDC line, is the risk of regulatory reforms. You need a sound and stable regulatory environment in order to make sure that you make money. Even if on the short term, the spot prices are very different and you can see value creation, you have no guarantee that this will last for 40 years. Or maybe only 15 or 20 if you have good bankers. Anyways, we have more interconnectors than maybe any other countries, HVDC, subsea. We are building now one to Germany and one to the UK. The first ones we built were easy because we could justify it to have security in dry years. The rain fluctuates about 40%, so it was good for us to have the diversification for the first cables. Nowadays, it's more a business proposal, and thereby it's more difficult. And what we have seen is also that with the regulated European business models, it's meant to be energy-only markets, but nobody believes in energy-only markets. So you have all sorts of schemes, capacity mechanisms, other mechanisms that makes it hard to make sure that you make money on the infrastructure and have the payback. And therefore, we do see that sometimes we need to get in either consumption, who's willing to go into long-term contracts, or you need banks or other financial institutions to be facilitators to make a good business model to set off HVDC cables. But they've so far always proven to make social welfare and to be very profitable. When you've got the business model, I think the next two challenges for us, the way we see it, are the first one is to make sure that you don't have curtailment. If you want the cable to be successful, you need to make sure that there is grid capacity on both ends of the cable. If not, you have a big risk. And the other one linked to that is to have local acceptance. We have experienced big challenges with local people not accepting the idea of having anything near them. The big joke at home is that the least favorable fruit for the engineer is the banana. You know why? It's the build nothing anywhere near anyone.
Some jokes are the same in every language.
So I think we've learned the hard way that we need to spend a lot of time to build understanding from any stakeholder, not just the customers, not just the politicians, but also from the local community, to have them to buy into the idea, and also within the norms of what we can contribute, to also make sure that there is enough in it for them locally to accept to have these huge infrastructure projects built. And that takes a lot of work, not just communication, but also long studies and lots of facts, which we are now spending a lot of time doing. The EU, if I can dare coming with some criticism, the EU has tried to make legislation for having fast-track building of projects. I don't believe in that. I think that if the resistance is within the local community or in the public opinion, it will come out one way or another, and you may force yourself for legislation, but I think the hard way of getting the locals to buy in, it's a much more sustainable and better way to build the projects. So I think I'll leave it there for now, unless there is something else I should have said.
No, not at all. You've touched on a couple of things I think we'll want to come back to. Diverse value of hydro, and my guess is several of you may think hydro is undervalued. Also, as we've talked about regulatory reform, we've talked about it as a positive. One of the points you were making is that for capital-intensive, long-lived assets, regulatory change could be very value destructive. And you've seen examples of that certainly among your neighbors.
I could maybe make just one joke or one story. I worked on the line to build a high-voltage DC cable to the Netherlands for 14 years. We spent 10 years making the business proposal and the regulatory regime, and 4 years to build it. And while working on it, you don't believe in it as much all the time. So we used to say with that line that once we build the cable and we put it in the sea, it'll be sunk cost. And when we get it up to the Netherlands, it'll be a stranded asset. It was paid down over 3 years.
There are a lot of barnacles on that comment, too. Anthony, again, quite a diverse perspective on the capital side of this. How do you look at what we've been talking about here?
Sure. Thanks, Bob. Yeah, look, Anthony Hadley from AMP Capital. I work in the infrastructure equity division there. AMP Capital is a Australian headquartered but global investment manager. We manage globally about $160 billion of assets, and within the infrastructure equity division that I'm situated in, it's around $13 billion globally. Notwithstanding my Australian accent, I'm actually based over in New York, as Bob said. And look, I guess I'd like to approach today by providing a perspective from the standpoint of an investor. In terms of how we look at the energy sector, and I should say the energy sector is a key focus for us. We also invest in transport and communications infrastructure over here in the US. But energy is basically where I spent more of my time. I think in terms of sort of challenges facing the industry, we like to say at AMP Capital, we look through a bit of a lens of what we like to call the energy trilemma. And that is it's basically referring to managing and coping with the challenges around the competing forces in the energy systems globally, of essentially managing prices and reducing prices for consumers of energy and electricity, coupling that with obviously the need to manage grid reliability and reliability of services of energy infrastructure. And doing all that while, basically achieving, the global sort of push towards reducing carbon. What I'd say, that's obviously some real challenges, I guess, that the energy supply industry is faced with, but I think that's obviously driving a lot of evolution. And with those challenges and evolution, I think from an investment standpoint, that's where we see good opportunities, to make investments on behalf of our LPs, obviously, hopefully good investments, and also be part of sort of funding the energy supply industry going forward. What else I would say is that in terms of just touching on our investment strategy, so we have a range of different investments across the energy and electricity supply sector globally, one of which is a 42% interest in Powerco, which Nigel Barber, we've been very fortunate to work with as our CEO for the last 5 years, I think it's been. So investment in sort of poles and wires utilities businesses are kind of front and centre. But what I'd also say, and maybe even more relevant to the discussion today, is a big focus for us is kind of investing in the 21st century of energy infrastructure. And I think that's really driven by those dynamics mentioned before around the energy trilemma and some of the opportunities arising in the sector by virtue of those competing forces that I mentioned. I'm sure it's got a lot of airtime today, but I guess off the back of that, a focus for us in terms of what we're looking for going forward, it's more and more, and this is quite region specific, but particular regions we're very interested in the energy storage sort of revolution, if I can put it that way. Obviously, some of those challenges I mentioned is really creating some good opportunities, for energy storage, driven by markets, with high penetration of renewables, and also sort of markets with, quite peaky loads. So I guess I'd leave it there as an introduction, but I guess from an investment standpoint, see the challenges and the evolution of this industry as a really good opportunity, and we're trying to, I guess, make the best use of that, and do a good job as an investment manager globally.
A follow-up question for you. The statement has been made to me. Technology is risky. You don't know what investments will or will pan out. When I invest in a utility, poles and wires, I'm looking for stability and predictability. I'll put my risk money over in a separate tech company. Doesn't sound like you take that view.
No, I wouldn't necessarily say that, Bob. I think a lot of it comes down to the risk return profile of the bucket of capital that we're talking about. So again, touching on Powerco very briefly, that's what I would consider the money that sits behind that we manage in terms of the investment in Powerco. That's what I would consider a sort of lower risk, lower return bucket of capital. So it's really matching the investment opportunity with the with the nature of the capital. I think is the question, and as I say, that capital is really lower risk, lower return, and an investment in something like Powerco or poles and wires utility business is really suited for that investment style. I touched on 21st century infrastructure and a bit of a focus in terms of energy storage, as I mentioned. Look, at what I would say, it's obviously a newer industry there. As a infrastructure investment fund, we would not take a view on a particular technology. We're not going to sort of back one particular flow battery over another lithium-ion type technology and say that's going to be the market winner in 5 years. I think the approach we take is we have a view that it's a market or a subsector of the energy infrastructure space that has really strong growth potential. So our approach in that sector would be more along the lines of partnering with a developer and to try and basically roll out investments across whatever region we're focusing on, North America in my case. But not take a punt on a particular technology. We would always sort of structure any arrangements we have as technology agnostic. So we might work with a particular developer, but they would most definitely have the flexibility to choose a different particular technology along the way. So to answer your question, Bob, we certainly do, if it's a low risk return sort of profile, look to invest in an asset such as a utility. We do look and like the higher return spectrum of storage and the sort of newer 21st century part of the investment space. But to your point, we wouldn't take a particular view or a big punt on a particular technology. That would more fall into a venture capital type basket.
Nigel,
Bob, if I could,
please.
if I just could add to some of what Anthony talking about, and
Listen,
from
I've never sat on a panel with my largest investor to my right. So you are very brave, but you've obviously earned his confidence as well.
Yeah, we'll discuss how much it's costing me later. But anyway, look, I think a good example Anthony's talking about is AMP Capital along with CSIRO, which is the Federal Australian peak science body, have a product called Evergen, and it's completely technology agnostic around. It's a battery storage with solar product in the market. It's agnostic as to the solar panel, the battery. The clever bit, which AMP Capital and CSR have worked on, and that's the bit the IP is in, is the bit that says, okay, we've developed a wholesale market forecast for the electricity price, and we've also developed a weather forecast model. We can roll those forward with reasonable confidence, 24 hours to 48 hours in advance. So rather than just as most battery/solar things optimize, they optimize for the use of electricity drawn from the grid. This actually optimizes for the price that you pay. And what they're actually seeing is actually people using more electricity, but they're paying less because it's optimizing for the cheapest use of electricity in the next 24 hours. It knows with high degrees of confidence how much solar you'll get off it. And that's a really clever use of effectively play money in the global scheme of how big AMP Capital is, but not actually backing an individual, this lithium ion versus that solar, silicon cell, but it's the IP that's gone into it. And I think that's sort of reflective of a clever example of that integrated energy system. Actually, you're looking at it, it's not the silicon or the lithium ion, it's the IP around how do we use those. In our case, we're the more traditional poles and wires, but that's the, by virtue of being regulated, almost, I hate the phrase, but you're almost an inflation index bond in terms of return. But when you're a portfolio investment, that's sort of what investors are looking for, possibly with some upside. But it is very much poles and wires type business. Now, just the topic itself, it's almost 3 bits to it: driving growth, driving performance, integrated energy systems. In terms of the growth story for poles and wires, there's obviously M&A, but in various markets, it's very much dependent. That doesn't tend to happen a lot in New Zealand. In our case, it's a modernisation/renewal story largely. We've just gone through our last rate case, been quite successful. We actually got 96% of all ask, which, as Anthony commented to me at dinner last night, a couple of nights ago, we didn't ask for enough, obviously.
I think Anthony should be grateful and appreciative of your good work.
Yeah, I thought 96% was pretty good, but anyway. But within that, there are clearly incentives to outperform on that, and investors and ourselves as a management team that prides itself on outperformance, you are always looking to show you understand those incentives and are looking to optimise results within it, as well as making sure you set yourself up each rate case for a reasonably successful outcome. In terms of sort of the integrated energy system, look, I picked on the Evergen one. I think it's a really good example, and it's all about that complexity and the tying of the stuff together. And it's all going to be very unique to whatever environment you're in. It's very hard to say there's a single silver bullet anywhere. I keep looking at it and I can't find it. I think you've got to take some general rules of thumb and then try to work your way through it. The Rocky Mountain Institute's got their great pie chart for where value for batteries comes from, and then you apply it to your circumstances. So, for example, in New Zealand, we don't, if you're looking at sort of wholesale market, it's just an energy-only market, so there's no capacity payments in the wholesale market to add to the energy-only market. Typically, the average price doesn't actually move up or down a lot. If it's a normal might double for peak, but it might not. There's unusual circumstances where we get a lot more, but it actually you start to work through that pie and what's on the table to try to make it work. And it's not a lot. I think I worked out one of our peers recently installed a 250 kilowatt battery, cost them $1.5 million, which is sort of the price, because actually most of the cost is not lithium ion, it's all in the power electronics and the civil work of putting these things in. But I worked out if you had no cost at all, including no cost of buying the energy, and you completely discharge the battery every day, you'd make $13,000 a year on a $1.5 million investment. And that just reflects the comment that it all depends on it. It's just simply very environmentally specific. Have you got capacity payments? Have you got constraints? Is there pots of money that you can tackle, or have you only got one or something? So I think that links it back to the whole growth / and the integration within the wider energy system ecosystem. You need those pots of money to really start to tap into the other stuff. If they're not there, it's harder to make it work.
Great, Gary.
Yeah, hi, Gary Sutherland, so from Hydro-Quebec. First of all, let me present to you my apologies. My boss could not be here today. Some of you may have heard of the Massachusetts Clean RFP, which is quite a big endeavor that Massachusetts put out a couple of years ago for a large chunk of clean energy that finally the state selected Hydro-Quebec for. So he is in the last stages, I would hope, of negotiation on that contract, which is actually the biggest in our history, so I think that kind of excuses him from being here today.
But he sent the 18.
It's not the 18, it's the 9.5. Yeah, it began as an 18 terawatt hour block of energy and ended up through legislative discussions as 9.5, but we're very happy with the 9.5 as well. So Hydro-Quebec is a vertically integrated utility working out of the province of Quebec. We have about 37,000 megawatts of installed capacity hydropower. So our output is 99.92% clean energy. From that, we have a few outlying regions that are still using thermal generation, just too far away from the grid, basically, to bring them in. We are also a major exporter throughout the Northeast. So about year in, year out, 15% of our volume goes outside of our borders. We sell into Ontario, into New York, into New England, and a little bit into the Maritimes as well. So I'm going to talk mainly about the export side of our business, so the wholesale, deregulated portion of our business. But maybe just to begin on the growth aspect, we have many of the same phenomena happening in Quebec that many of you are living with, so pretty stagnant load growth. A lot of pressure to keep rates down. Of course, our shareholder is the government of Quebec, so we have basically pledged over the next few years to keep our tariff growth around inflation. So what we see coming up is, with increasing maintenance costs on our system, we're basically going to be looking at lower and lower return on investment and lower dividends sent back to our shareholders. So we have kind of had a strategic planning exercise recently that has brought us to the understanding that we're going to have to go outside of Quebec for our growth strategy, and that has two main avenues. The first being the export market, which we've been very active in the past. We are hoping to increase what we're doing in the export market. And the second is to get back into the M&A field. So acquisitions of hydroelectric assets in various parts of the world, or high voltage transmission grids. So I'm going to more focus maybe on the first aspect, the export markets. We're in a little bit of the same type of position as Norway is, really. When I heard Astrid speak, there's a lot of similarities here. We act a little bit as a major supplier both in New York and New England. New York, we're about 5% of their load, and New England about 12%. But looking forward, we're looking at kind of a changing role as well for us in those markets. So while we have been a major energy supplier, and we will continue to be an energy supplier over the next few years, the Massachusetts contract that's coming up being maybe the biggest example, so largest single contract in our history, and a contract which is going to allow us to build a new HVDC line into New England, and that's something that we haven't done now for 25 years. So that's a major development for us. But looking even further than that, what we see happening in our markets, of course, as is the case in many markets out there in the room, is a lot more variable generation coming online. The Northeast has very aggressive climate change goals. Depends on the state, but it's about 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So they're looking at bringing on a lot of solar power, a lot of wind power, and of course both of those will have to be backed up and balanced by a baseload generator. And as we go forward in time with those climate change goals, natural gas is going to be less and less easy to use in that sense. So Hydro-Quebec is seeing ourselves and our reservoir capacity more and more as being a storage capacity, so a big battery basically for this entire region. Perhaps not to do those variations on a daily basis because chemical batteries do that very effectively, but on a longer term basis, be it maybe a 4 or 5 day period when there's less generation or more generation, if there's excess generation in those regions as well, that's something that we can absorb within our reservoirs and be able to send it back at higher demand periods, but also even over seasons. We have about 176 terawatt hours of storage capacity in our reservoirs. So to maybe put that into context, it's a little bit more than New York's annual consumption of energy, of electricity. So a lot of our work recently has been looking at, fine, we have these wonderful 2050 goals. How do we get there? And what types of things are we going to need from the market, from regulators, from governments in our export markets to be able to send the right signals to basically get things rolling on the Quebec side, both on the generation side and on the transmission side. And one of our major dilemmas with this is that it does take about 10 to 15 years to design, permit, and construct a hydropower plant. So this is not something that we can do and get energy to market within the space of an RFP or any type of other solicitation like that. So we need those cues far in advance. We started to get them, in the beginning of the 2000s with a lot of the discussion about renewable portfolio standards throughout the Northeast. We are not eligible for those, but we saw the clean energy transition coming. So we started building on the generation side, and we've actually brought about 5,000 megawatts online since then. So that capacity is what is allowing us today to be able to participate in some of these RFPs that are out there.
You are not eligible because hydro, at least existing hydro,
It's
is
a
not
mature
considered
technology.
renewable.
Yeah. So renewable portfolio standards in many of the Northeast states are basically subsidy programs for emerging technologies that need a little bit of an extra help to finance
And
projects.
do those subsidies ever go away in your experience?
I don't see very much of that happening these days, no. No. Programs are being changed a little bit. Some things are being added. New York, has added what they call a ZEC, so it's a zero emission credit for the nuclear industry, but we still see RPS as being very firmly implemented. So much of what we've been doing recently, it's a little bit interesting in a study that was launched actually just Monday at Bloomberg New Energy Finance in New York, is on decarbonizing the entire Northeast and what could be the possible contribution of a big generator with a lot of storage capacity like Hydro-Quebec. This is a group out of Columbia University that works with the economist Jeffrey Sachs, and they basically go from state to state or country to country, and they look at how you can decarbonize your economy and what types of scenarios are possible. And very interesting, what came out of this scenario is, of course, there's going to have to be massive deployment of renewables throughout the region and a massive switch from a whole lot of energy sources towards electricity, and then a decarbonization of the electricity sources. But also looking at just collaboration and cooperation on a much larger regional basis that would allow us to bring very important cost savings into this whole endeavor. So those cost savings, just to give you a little bit of an idea, have been more or less estimated about $4 billion in today's dollars at the 2050 horizon for increased exports and increased cooperation with Hydro-Quebec. And those exports could be wind and they could be hydro. So when we're looking at what we could kind of consider at Hydro-Quebec to be our obsession, decarbonizing as much as we can, but doing it at at a rate that is acceptable to our ratepayers, those types of synergies start to get really interesting. And I'll leave it there.
Let's go back to the larger question of the external environment, where you see alliances and partnerships. Electrification has a number of different components. Obviously, there's providing service and providing higher levels of service to those who don't currently have it. Conversion to electrification is obviously a growth area you've each looked at. So talk about how you're thinking about those external relationships. Yeah, let's go right down again.
I'm on. I think I go back to the liberalization of the electricity sector. We did that in Norway in 91, one of the first countries in the world. Latin America was before us, but we were amongst the first. And then we came from the era of the engineer, when the system was well constructed, well built. And there were some economists at the university, business school in Bergen, who said that this sector has potential for cost savings. So the whole idea of the liberalization at that time was that we shouldn't invest. The only thing we should invest in was to utilize what we had in a better way. And so we did. Took on more risk in the operations and tried to connect as much as we could without doing more than that. Then we had some research showing what we've discussed here today, that people rely more on electricity now, or reliable electricity now than at any other time, that our grid is aging, and that there is a need for connection of the grid. That was a wake-up call. And I think not just in Norway, but in Europe, there is enormous investment in the transmission and the distribution grid. And we do now see that in the future, for a normal household customer, the grid tariff is going to cost them as much or more than the electricity as such. They have to pay for the availability. So we've gone from the era of the economist to the new era, whatever that is. But there is a new era, and there is a new era where the politicians understand that if they want reliable electricity, if they want to meet the Paris goals, if they want to have e-mobility, as we call it, we don't just talk about cars. We have electrical buses. We've got the first one in Oslo. We have electrical ferries who go from battery to battery. The e-mobility is beyond cars. If they want all of that, they need grid development. And it takes normally for us much more time to develop grid than to make new production or new consumption. So the chicken and egg discussion is not there. You need to start with the grid, and you need to have the business model for the grid. So I think, yeah?
No, I was going to say success or failure of liberalization and privatization usually depends on how well defined the goals are. In your case, the dismal scientists gave you an efficiency goal, and that at some point had to yield to other objectives.
It was fine for the time,
Yep.
but that time lapsed, and now it's a new era. I don't want to say it wasn't a success, because it was a success. We had cheap energy for decades, but then that era was over, and now it's a new era with the Paris Agreement, with globalization, with trading options, with the rest of Europe. And then we have to invest, and with the dependency on electricity. So now there is an acceptance in a country for spending, and the regulator in the Nordic countries accept that we have to spend. And I think that's a prerequisite for the development, and it has been a very important wake-up call for the industry.
From an investor perspective, is this a growth opportunity?
I think exactly that's what it is, because we have the fundamentals. We talked about earlier today about innovation or R&D. For us, that is part of the operations. So we don't discuss it. We're going to do it like the, I've forgotten the Englishman. I've forgotten your name. Basil. He said, you want to do it smart. So whether it's R&D or innovation or just doing it, you've got to do it the smartest way. And we've got acceptance for that. And I think that's very, very important. And when I see at the European arena, when we discuss the market design, what we do see is that the regulators, they're not sitting there at the table negotiating, but they are sitting behind the distributors or behind the TSOs, and they don't agree. And that there is no way that those who are sitting around the table can agree if those who are giving the mandates are giving them incompatible mandates. So they are, in a way, taking the role of the negotiator and going in detailed monitoring the TSOs or the DSOs and hindering them from succeeding in their business and distorting growth. And luckily, we do not have that in the Nordics. And I think it's been a wake-up call. And I think it's an important wake-up call. And I think it's an important development.
Anthony, how does electrification fit into your long-term strategy?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Bob. Yeah, look, I think we touched on some of those things before. What I would say is, it's what's key, I think, as an investor is it's cliche, but really kind of identifying the value proposition. And actually, I'll touch on something that Nigel mentioned before. And I was joking before this panel that I brought Nigel along so I could throw any questions his way that I couldn't answer, but I'll have to have a word to him because he stole my thunder on Evergen earlier. No, just kidding. But no, just touching on Evergen before again, because I think it's a really good example of what I'm talking about there. Evergen, as Nigel mentioned, it's a solar plus storage residential initiative in Australia, whereby we have partnered with the CSIRO. The Aussies in the room will know the CSIRO is a very well-respected government science body. Look, it's a small kind of venture and initiative as we stand today, but we think it has a lot of growth potential. And I guess something that I found really interesting is, I think there's several hundred homes now where this Evergen system has been rolled out. It's typically Tesla batteries coupled with rooftop storage, and it has some really good smarts behind it. As we mentioned before, it looks at kind of forecasting weather over the next 24 to 48 hours. It has some ability to understand and assess current tariffs in the system, and it's also got some smarts around managing use of the battery to really maximise efficiency and maximise battery life. The thing I found really interesting in terms of recent developments with Evergen is I think close to 50 homes in ACT, which is Australia's capital, Canberra, recently signed up for basically a virtual power plant type initiative, which was agreed with the local distribution network ActuAGL. So let me take a step back for a second. Evergen, I think has been demonstrated to save households, where it's been installed at up to $2,000 a year in electricity bills. So that obviously shows, the value proposition to the customer in this context. In terms of what I mentioned about that virtual power plant type initiative with ActuAGL, the distributor in that region. It's been successfully demonstrated through this group of 50 homes, whereby there was basically a demand response testing, which was successfully sort of rolled out and demonstrated, and there's an ongoing initiative now with ActuAGL, whereby if the function of demand response is required from the grid operator, Evergen can and will provide that service going forward. So look, the value proposition I spoke to for the customer there, but I think that also really touches on the value proposition for the grid operator in that context as well. And from, I guess, the perspective of an infrastructure investor, and how we look, thematically at our investments, it's really identifying, as I said, a value proposition for all stakeholders. In this case, the customer, the grid, and also ourselves and our LPs as the investors that sit behind that capital. And if I could, sum up thematically how we look at the space and the opportunities going forward, I think that's a really good example.
Nigel.
So a little bit more on growth, is it, Bob? So I must admit the jet lag is kicking in. So, look, I think in a general sense, and let's just talk about electrification, and I think the point was again cooperation around it. So electrification of transportation in New Zealand will probably be the first cab off the rank. We've been, and our New Zealand peers, and Transpower's in the room, Unison and Orion also in the room, been doing a lot in that space, but it actually hasn't required a lot of dollars involved, because when you stand back and think about it, it'll be residential / light vehicles that will be the first ones off the rank. They're the ones that are being, the units that are being built the most at the moment, and they will by and large be charged at home. So I played around with an electric Golf, an e-Golf for 6 months. My standard daily commute is 40 Ks, so what's that, 26-ish miles or something like that. And it was $1.40 roughly a day. But if you had to go to the fast charger to give you your roughly 100 miles charge, it was $11. So our investment so far has largely been helping put the fast chargers in, but we don't actually see them. And there was the sort of discussion on one of, I think, John, your panel about whether they're really going to be there for long, or just completely a transition which will be wiped out as other things come on. But the fast chargers themselves are not really getting a lot of use. They're getting a lot of use for companies that are offering them for free, because people are stopping it on the way home and charging their car and then going home. But if they're paying for them, it's not uncommon to see them only used twice a week. No one's going to make back the money on a $60,000 fast charger if it's being used twice a week at $11. But it's there for the purpose of giving people that range anxiety thing. So our bit has been helping them get these investments in, and in some cases we've funded it directly. Other cases we've just done all the upstream augmentation of them. And a third party's owned them. On our network, we've said, look, we would prefer people to pay for them. So they've got a payment system. They pay a market charge. We don't think people should be getting it for free, but we won't end up rolling out masses of them, but we will make sure there's enough rolled out that people are confident that they can use them. And we suspect over time, you'll actually see the use drop, because people will overcome that range anxiety and get comfortable with, actually, I'm going to get home. I don't need to stop there and spend $11. I'll get home tonight. I'll spend $1.40. So that's, as I said, electrification, the first cab off the rank. The process heat one, which is the big load, is going to be a lot harder. The debate in New Zealand is sort of twofold. One is, okay, if your heat processors are using coal, the first debate is natural gas going to be an acceptable transitional fuel? And the second debate is, how quickly do I have to move relative to particularly if you're an exporting company, how quickly do I have to move relative to my competitors? And that's a difficult one. They're both quite difficult issues. Looking on the New Zealand websites this morning, it looks like our government is about to announce a ban on, ban on all offshore and new onshore gas exploration. You'll be able to continue to develop existing fields, but all new, other than one particular region. So it's sort of sending a signal that actually gas might not be as much of a transitional fuel in New Zealand as what it's seen elsewhere. And then it's just that whole question of the second one. If you're not going to go to gas, what do you go to, and how do you manage that competitiveness? And it's a really thorny issue. And that is not just as a distributor. To some extent, the price that they pay us is almost irrelevant compared to how much does that, the difference if they're going to biofuels affect the exporter in terms of its market position in its countries of where it's slugging it out in real time against competitors. So we're just waiting to seeing how that falls. But there is a lot of discussion, but and the sector will be important. But to some extent we're not subsidiary to it, but we're not the prime bit on this piece.
Gary, you took in your strategic plan essentially a 50-year point of view, flat load at home, export and M&A. What is your view of electrification then, and what kind of outreach are you doing to your customers, stakeholders?
So we have a little bit of a different situation maybe. We already use electricity for heating purposes at about 77% of our residential and commercial customers. So there is a little bit of a wedge there that we can still go and look at. We are, of course, looking at things like electric transportation. That's about 40% of Quebec's greenhouse gas footprint. And we've rolled out in the last few years, I believe we're up to about 1,400 fast charging stations throughout Quebec. One of our major challenges, of course, is just the size of our territory and how can you do that in regions where you have a very low population density. One of the things that we've looked at is a business model whereby Hydro-Quebec actually will provide the electricity services, we will provide the technology for the fast charging stations, but we have partners. They can be supermarkets, they can be gyms, they can be just about anything where people will go and spend a certain amount of time. They're actually paying for the infrastructure to be installed, and they're using it as a marketing ploy, basically to bring people into their commerce or to their service, leave their car there to be recharged, and quite often they will actually pay for the recharge. We're a little bit less expensive than you are. We're $2.50 Canadian for a full charge, but that's just a little bit of a reflection of our rate structure and our lousy dollar. So that's electrification on our side of the border. Those are the types of things that we're looking at. We're also looking at a few new clients that are possible. So data centers. Someone was talking a little bit about the blockchain industry this morning. Those are, of course, sectors that we are very interested in. On the blockchain side, we are being careful about what's going on.
Post a bond.
Yeah, it's whereas data centers are something that I think we understand in a very easy way, and there are very well-established companies out there that are looking for those types of things. Blockchain, Bitcoin industry players, some of them are well-known, some of them aren't. So we're going at that slowly, looking at, we've actually had more than 10,000 megawatts of hookup requests in the last, I would say, 6 months. So it's a major part of the industry that could be coming in. But the other electrification factor that we're looking at is how can we be a better source of supply for our external markets? And that's a big one for us. It's a big portion. I was mentioning it was about 15% of our volume, but it represents probably 27% of our profit margin at the end of the year.
We started a little bit late.
Bob, could I just add one thing on electrification of transport? I can't emphasise this enough. It depends, and probably in the Hydro-Quebec case or Basel in London, in downtown Quebec, very different to say my network where 99% of everybody will have off-street parking and some access to a secure charging facility. Everyone's network will be different. You will get very, very different dynamics, which also then changes the opportunity set. So I just wanted to make
and you have to really evaluate that ecosystem and be strategic about what you do to really nurture it.
Exactly. If you've got no off-street parking, but people do want to charge their cars, then you're up to some quite clever things on there. Or alternatively, if there's limited off-street parking but not outside your house, how can you how can you create powered vertical connected space for people to effectively use those? So.
Charging stations at pubs. I got home from work as soon as I can, but I had to stop to charge the car.
Well, I'll let you debate the ethics of that, given all our zero harm goals, but anyway.
We did start just a little bit late, but we do want to make time for a couple of questions or comments. Anyone? Floor is open. Yeah. It's making its way over. And thanks again for your contribution to what EEI refers to as its lexicon project.
Quick question. The word retail hasn't really been mentioned much today. If I give an example, in New Zealand, there's a retailer who's offering electricity at basically the wholesale price that tracks the wholesale price plus a small margin, which is very different than the traditional market of the generator then hedges with the retailer. What's the panel's view in terms of that customer segment in that retail space? And is there growth and value potential in terms of different models around that?
Different revenue models at the retail level.
I can be very short if we're going to go round. We have that same product in Norway in retail, that you can have a spot market price plus a margin. And you can choose, it's like bank loans, you can have floating or you can have fixed pricing. I'm not in the retail business, so I don't want to have a big opinion on whether that's a good business proposal or not.
Look, in terms of our business, it's, by law, we're not really allowed to retail other than to a very small number of customers, so it's something we haven't focused on. I can see the model. It works for some it works for niche, and I think in the northeast they're called energy supply companies. So it works for niche ones, getting market entry. They don't have to, because they're not taking a hedge position, they won't lose their skin. I think if you're a customer, it's you. How confident are you that you won't wake up one day and there's a massive price spike and your bill's gone from being really affordable to very unaffordable? And that's a risk decision. And I think as long as everyone knows that's the possible outcome, then I think we're all big boys and girls, including at home, when we make our decisions on our energy suppliers.
In Quebec, of course, we work on a regulated structure, so a very detailed tariff structure that doesn't really give us a whole lot of maneuvering room to do much on the retail side. I would say maybe the other major challenge is that the cost of electricity in Quebec is very low. So your average residential customer is probably paying about 7.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So even we've looked and we've done pilot projects and things like time use. They just really don't make any difference because at that rate people are not necessarily displacing their use of electricity within the day. On our outside markets, of course, we work on the wholesale market price, and I would say what maybe needs to be rethought on that side is how do you integrate values that are not captured in the marketplace right now? Clean energy maybe being the first one, in our case in the Northeast, but flexibility in terms of your resource. A resource that can ramp up within minutes should not be considered in exactly the same way as one that will take hours in a market where you're going to have a lot of fluctuations. And we've looked a lot at the Californian example. We see the Northeast moving a little bit towards something that may look at one point like a duck curve. And that's when flexibility capable resources are going to be much more important than they are today. However, there's no market value that's established for those.
My 2 cents, for what it's worth, would be I would love a model that was more customer driven in terms of how prices were set. That's why I appreciated the conversation that Brian led. To have a couple of basic principles, offer a standard offer product, much like what we have now, but then very, very quickly put things out, see what makes sense to customers rather than having prices administratively determined by regulators, economists, politicians, lawyers, whatever. Really, really tough to get to. Probably, it sounds like it's tough to get to just about everywhere in the world, unfortunately. Certainly in the U.S. in most jurisdictions it is. Yep. Others? Yeah, please.
Okay.
Back here. Yep. Oh, okay, good, very good.
Just
Thanks for-
Astrid, Norway has been a major leader in electric vehicles, and I think you have probably the highest percentage of any country in the world. And you're also talking about moving away from internal combustion engines in a fairly tight period. And I wonder if you can say, what your thoughts are about what those goals are, and the question of autonomous vehicles. Do you see a lot of autonomous vehicles on the road in Norway in the near future?
With the easy one. We do not have autonomous vehicles around the roads, as I'm aware. When it comes to electrical vehicles, it's very popular. We do not use, we produce oil and gas. Of course, we have petrol. Petrol is very expensive because it's highly taxed. We do not use our gas domestically. We do not have any car industry to protect. We have had very favorable conditions for electrical cars. I think we have the highest Tesla. So it's more Teslas in Norway than any other place, maybe but California. And I think that's because cars are very highly taxed, import tax, but because they didn't have much tax on these fantastic Teslas, people could get a very good sports car for very little money. And it's cheap to operate. And electrical vehicle makes sense because we have 96% hydro production. So your car will go on environmental friendly fuel. And there is a political movement to go into, like I called it, e-mobility. So we want, but we do not just want cars. Like I said, we've got now buses, we've got ferries. And ferries are good because they can go from battery charger to battery charger. They go from one place to the other. And we've also worked on harbors, where I think in addition to land transport, shipping is a huge polluter. And we have long harbors, a long coastline. So we want them to go on land power when they're on harbors and won't let in cruise ships and other ships into our beautiful nature if they're going to pollute. So there is some politics there for using green land power when they're on docks. We also have other vessels that we design and have visions on having electrical ships, not just ferries, but other ships, but that's a longer ahead. But yes, there is a very strong political movement for meeting the Paris goals, and because, like I said, electricity is green, the next step is then the mobility and the transport sector, and there is a lot done in it. But public acceptance is also a challenge. It was in the papers just before I came that they wanted to forbid cars in Oslo and street parking. And of course, there is diverse opinions on that. So it'll be interesting to see how it develops. But there is a lot going on, and it has a lot of political focus for the time being.
Tom, I know you would say, buy it to save the planet, drive it because it's fun. It's a great car. And you will get the last question.
No, we got one more back.
Oh, pardon me. You will not get the last question.
Thank you. Norway's such a world leader in all of these things. But I guess my question for all of you are companies, are you doing things now to educate the public about the value of electricity and what you're doing to keep things green? And or are you helping people understand the importance of energy conservation? I mean, I don't see it communicated that much, and I think just curious about what you're doing individually as companies. Thank you.
First, ladies first again. It is hard because there is a lot to be done, but it is difficult to sell. So we are doing a lot on the planning and analysis side, but we are also, each time we are planning to build something or renew something in an area, we will always have a communication plan, which not goes to the stakeholders, to the customers and the stakeholders, but also to the local communities. And we would normally have in our licensing procedures measures that we have to do to facilitate better living for those who are affected by the transmission lines or substations or whatever it is. And we always have communication more than that. And when I started about the banana joke, and which I think is a reality, and how important and how hard we've learned that we need to get the population to buy in. With that learning curve, we always have a communication program for any investment project. And I think if it's one place we've scaled up significantly, that is on the communication to the local population. For the understanding of the green, that is not our job. So that's outside the scope of the company. But we do it for our business and what's within the scope and facilitating our business. We are doing a lot and we are spending a lot of money on that. And also on the research and the statistics, so you can give people not just glossy paper, but facts. And we're having meetings, not just electrical communications and papers, but we're having local meetings with people, with hearings. And that's one of the things that we realized when we didn't have social acceptance for some projects, is that you need to go out there and talk to people, and you need to go to talk to people before you start the project, so that if they have something they want to change, that you can give them something and that you can prove that you listen to them. You don't just talk to them, but you communicate with them and adapt to the extent it makes sense for the business.
I think there's two parts, if I've heard the question right, and Astrid's comment. So there's sort of an energy efficiency and then a sort of broader sustainability part. So in New Zealand, the energy efficiency part, the government has sort of put its hand up and said, look, this is more a social service, and they have a government agency, Energy Efficiency and Conservation Agency. Its sole focus is getting those messages out there. It's reasonably resourced. It works across heavy industry all the way down to residential, and as well as there's a targeted program for insulation of low-income houses, funded by the government, and in addition, the government is slowly increasing the energy efficiency standards for existing and new houses, starting with new and then periods of time for existing. So that's making quite a big difference. You know, I think it's certainly easier to get the negative watt, and it's more cost effective than solar or batteries for income. On the sustainability one, we probably don't blow our own trumpet enough, and we're not as fortunate as Norway or Quebec, but we're in that 80+% renewable anyway. So we sort of take it a little bit for granted, but as a company that is owned by investors, one of the most interesting things I've observed, and Anthony might be interested in commenting on this from sort of the level of investors up, is that environmental sustainability and governance type stuff is becoming an important investment criteria. You know, we've been doing the GRESB, I think it's a Global Real Estate Environmental Sustainability, I forgot what the B is, survey now for the last 3 years. And it certainly receives a lot of prominence, probably more in Europe, but it is quite a big deal. And the score you get on is quite a big deal. So we're certainly seeing that being a factor.
Yeah, and I'll just pick up quickly off Nigel's comments there. Absolutely right, ESG, and I know it got a bit of airtime in the previous panel, but for those that don't know, it's environmental, social, and governance. GRESB is a global kind of industry body, that oversees and encourages, those aspects of investing, and I guess you can sum it up in 2 words, and that's responsible investing. And just, I guess, to put a bit of context around Nigel's comments there in terms of the growing importance, and it's important obviously to us as an investment manager, and obviously very, very important as well to our LPs that basically provide the capital that we invest. Some years ago, obviously, when you're buying an asset, for example, Powerco, you run a number of due diligence streams, to basically assess the business, the risks involved, and understand exactly what you're buying. Typical due diligence streams are obviously, market due diligence, tax due diligence. You get an accountant to look through all the books, technical due diligence. And I guess the point I'm making today, there's a new due diligence stream, certainly at AMP Capital, called the ESG due diligence stream. Every time we're buying a company, we have a ESG specialist that basically does quite a detailed ESG review of that business. We'll have external advisors to assist us with that process. But it's really kind of up there in terms of the importance of buying a business alongside, understanding the historical performance, understanding the technology, the technical risks if there are any, legal risks, contracts, etc. So it's part and parcel with investing today.
On our side, maybe just to begin with the energy efficiency question, this is something that we've been working on for a long time, and I think we've probably gotten most of the low-hanging fruit already. Massive conversion to electronic thermostats, light bulb programs, various timers for swimming pools. We've looked at all that sort of and offered credits for customers as well so that they can have access to those types of technologies. Now I think we are getting to the point where the big objectives would be things like having the building code changed in an effective way. That's not something that depends on the electricity utility, of course, in the province. That's a government initiative, but that would really make a difference, especially in our climate where about half of your electricity bill goes to heating, space and water heating. Once again, it's a tough thing to do, and it's a tough thing to basically tell your population to invest in those types of things when the incentive of a high electricity bill is not there. So if you're not paying that much for your electricity and you're looking at installing a heat pump in an existing residence in Quebec, you're probably not coming into your money before about 30 years. So you're going to think about it a few times before you actually do it. But there's a lot still to be done there, and I like to say on the power market side that every kilowatt hour that we save in Quebec is one that we can eventually send to our export markets. So not only there's a very commercial side of that, is that we're bringing more money into the province, but there's also a side of decarbonizing somebody else. We cannot really do that in Quebec anymore because of our 99.whatever%, but we can do it outside of our immediate control area. On the social acceptability aspect, so we do many of the same things that are done in Norway. We tend to involve our communities both on the generation and the transmission side in our projects right from the design phase. So we don't like to come in with a ready-made solution and just consult the public. We'll have them come in to determine where a line should go right from the beginning and have them actively participate. We actually have about 14 community relations groups that are permanent employees in all of the regions of Quebec that basically maintain a continual dialogue with the populations on any one of our aspects. So when we do go into a region to begin a project in either generation or transmission or distribution, those teams are already in place. They already have their relationships with the community officials and with the local populations in many cases. There's only 8 million of us in the entire province of Quebec. So relationships tend to be very, very important things, and that's definitely a plus on our side as well.
One last question. Ready to go.
Yeah. So a little different spin on this topic of electrification in light of what's happening here in Washington this week with Facebook, right? We talk about electrification and making it part of an integrated energy network. Connecting into the home, who owns the customer behind the meter, smart charging, artificial intelligence, distribution system operation, and all the things that are interconnected in the world of the future. And just wondering how, as you approach the growth aspect of that in investment, how do you think about data privacy? How do you think about securing these networks and systems? And is that part of the work you do as you approach how to move strategically into these areas of growth?
And very quick answers, please. My guess is all of you, in terms of data privacy, are way the heck more regulated than Facebook. And I bet, again, they have way the heck more data about your customers than you do.
Well, I'll be the contrary on that one. Look, it is something we have to think about, but at the moment we are entirely a B2B platform. So all we know for an individual customer is a meter number and an address. So that's our starting point, and we'll have to just migrate our way there through them. And the bigger answer, it all depends, really. in New Zealand, it's certainly a trend in Australia, and it's and Baz talked about this in the UK context. Structurally separated markets, been structurally separated a long time, with a strong preference for the competitive market-led solutions. That will take us. Well, that will sort of largely dictate sort of the it-depend answer on where we end up in it, and we'll just work our way through that.
We are just rolling out smart meters, where all the data will go to us as the TSO. That puts cybersecurity and security for data at the top of the agenda for risk and for risk mitigation.
Yeah, look, I'll admit a few years ago we were looking at well, we actually did, were successful in acquiring a small regional airport in the UK. And again, touching back on due diligence work streams, our insurance due diligence advisor mentioned that we should consider a new insurance policy in the program for that airport being cybersecurity. It was, from memory, $300,000 to $400,000 per annum, policy. In terms of the policy costs that we'd have to pay. I sort of laughed at the time and thought, this advisor's trying to upsell me. But since then, it's, that these risks obviously are growing ever more prevalent. And today it's kind of front and centre in terms of the way we look at investments and risks.
I'd echo some of the comments that I've heard. We've finished our deployment of smart meters right across Quebec, and this has always been a major component of the discussion that we've had with the public on the rollout of smart meters is what's going to happen to the data that's involved. So we have put this under the same hat of cybersecurity as we use on both our generation and our transmission assets, which are both strategic pieces of our grid that we have to protect against basically any threats that come from the outside. So we pretty much have a double computer system within the company. One system that works only on the data, that has absolutely no contact with the outside world, outside of our own system. We actually run the biggest fiber optic network within Quebec, just Hydro-Quebec system. And then we have another one that is anybody in an office that needs access to the internet. So that's one of the ways that we've done it, with a firewall between those two systems.
It's a very good discussion. We didn't talk really, other than peripherally, about internal organization. I'd like to go back to where actually Chris started us this morning with that great table of his, operational considerations and then exploration. The Navigant papers are fantastic. Their paper in particular on how you balance operations and growth is very, very good. We've all read that. Internally at Northwestern, I talk about left side of the page, right side of the page. The commonality is, in our case, left side of the page. It's most of your revenue, most of your assets, most of your risk. Right side of the page is where you really need to pay attention. That long 50-year point of view, I think, is a great approach. It's been said that the CFO and the COO primarily responsible for left side of the page. You need good people doing that. The CEO's job is to push a little bit on the right side of the page. So again, good discussion. I know we'll be coming back and talking about that probably over cocktails in a little bit. Please join me in thanking this great panel.